This is the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast from Advanta IRA, where we show you how to explore investments beyond Wall Street and open your eyes to new options for your portfolio. It's time to take control and give yourself the freedom to choose where you invest your money.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Today, we are very pleased to welcome on Bronson Hill with Bronson Equity. Going to be talking about a subject that gets certainly a ton of press, and that's going to be inflation, but more specifically, kind of how we can look at this as investors. It's maybe not necessarily a horrible thing. With the old adage, if there's blood in the streets, buy property. Maybe a little bit kind of a gruesome aspect to look at, but the sentiment holds true. If there's certain market inflections or things that are happening that would otherwise scare off investors, well, there's opportunities that can be had. And inflation certainly is one of those. When you think about the purchasing power of your dollar not going as far, well, maybe why is that? And not necessarily thinking that it could always just be a bad thing, and understanding where some of those opportunities might lie for us as investors, especially in the realm of real estate, is very important, because we shouldn't let these things kind of scare us off. Price points being high, interest rates being, well, now coming back down. All these things can certainly do to play into a very fearful mindset. But if you can understand and how to navigate that, that's really where the value can be derived in this market, because that's what we're all looking for as investors, and specifically in real estate, is where to find value, where to create value. And looking at places that people might otherwise look over and not understand is a great place to start. So Bronson, thank you very much for being on with us today. If you wouldn't mind, give us a bit of background about yourself before we kind of springboard into the topic today.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate it, Alex. Great to be here. And we basically, a little background, I started in medical device sales years ago. I was making good money, but the thing that I realized, a lot of my colleagues and a lot of physicians, some physicians I worked with made millions of dollars a year, literally, as cardiologists. And people just didn't have control over their time. So it took me down a road to learn about alternative assets, passive investing. Obviously, you guys do alternative assets. And so people listening, I imagine that you kind of drank the Kool-Aid at some point and said, this is actually way better, right? Getting involved in things outside of the stocks and other sort of traditional investments. And I was actually also a registered investment advisor for a few years. And I kind of saw almost that experience of the Wizard of Oz, seeing the man behind the curtain, right? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And so I realized the traditional way we're educated and taught by Wall Street is just because there's so much money there. And there was a time in the 30s and 40s where people would say, why would you ever do stocks? Like, it was considered so risky, but it's kind of how interesting everything's flipped just based on perception. But anyway, I started learning about multifamily investing, started raising capital for different deals. I started with single family before, but realized it was not getting there as quickly as I wanted to. And so started raising capital, and then fast forward about 6 years, we've raised about $45 million for different assets. We've branched out from just multifamily alone. Now we do businesses. We're doing car washes, oil and gas. We're buying a large e-commerce business now. We're doing things that provide cash flow appreciation or tax benefits for investors. And then I talk about, educational topics such as how do we use inflation to our advantage. So I look forward to talking more about it.
Yeah, and great. It's always, before we kind of jump specifically on that topic, I always like to maybe ask people, especially because ask anyone that's involved in commercial real estate, and certainly there are plenty of people that are like, I kind of started, in commercial real estate, but most everyone has a similar trajectory to you, at least when they get into this specific market of saying, look, I started with single family, but that's kind of what I knew. Most people, with the exception of high population density places, LA, maybe New York, Chicago's, most everyone lives in a house at some point in their life, whether it was growing up or whether what you're doing right now. So you understand kind of the value of that investment class, right? Single family is easy to wrap your head around. Someone needs a place to live, whether it's one person, two persons, or a small family. Well, they need four walls and a roof, right? So understanding kind of the utility and the need for it, and also the scarcity of it, right? Personally living here in Pinellas County in Florida, which, fun fact, we're actually the highest population density county in the state of Florida, not Miami, as most people like to think, but living on a peninsula, there's no green space. It's building up, and the inventory is kind of fixed. So again, most people especially can kind of see that scarcity just by driving down the road, and they kind of understand that supply and demand. But when it came to you, and most people kind of that similar viewpoint of saying, hey, look, the amount of effort and the throughput that I'm getting from single family, I could, if I could do one multifamily where it's essentially kind of 50 houses in one rip, or, whatever metric is that you're using for that kind of first deal, what did that kind of transition look like? What were some of the lessons that you learned saying, okay, here's my last single family into my first multifamily? Because sometimes it can be very easy transition. Sometimes people learn a couple of very hard fought lessons when it comes to making that transition. So I always like to ask people when they do that, which a lot of our guests do, what did that look like for you? What were some kind of the fun anecdotes that you maybe learned going from the single to the multifamily space?
Yeah, so I think we all, like you said, we're familiar with single family. We've lived in a house usually at some point in our lives, and so it's familiar. So we think, oh, I'm going to do real estate. I know I should. A lot of wealthy people do real estate, and so I did it. I started buying single family houses in the Cleveland area. These were houses were getting something, this was years ago, but $15,000 to $30,000, and then we were putting some money into it and renting them out. And what the things that really didn't work out, I mean, these weren't like, A plus type of areas. These were areas that were a little bit rougher areas, maybe 3 or 4 out of 10 as far as, maybe a place you wouldn't necessarily want to live, but, the renters are there. But they, the tenants had challenges. They would either damage the property, they wouldn't pay, the city was involved. They would come in, you would mow the lawn, they'd give you a big ticket, and it'd be hundreds of dollars. It was just, there were things that it never really worked out the way that we penciled it. And that's the challenge. I think even now, especially when you go to buy a single family, it's a very long-term way of growing wealth, and people do it over 20 plus years, and they'll generate a lot of wealth, but it takes a very long time, and it doesn't really typically generate the cash flow or the returns that people want. I know friends that buy homes, and then they're looking for cash flow from it, and it's if you have a 2.5% interest rate on something, maybe it does work out really well, right? But those are you can't really get those now. Now you're more like a 7%, right? So anything that did cash flow is either negative cash flow, like in California. It's easier. It's about 2 or 3 times as cheap to rent here than it is to buy just from the mortgage. So there's a spread there. So I think it's really important to look at what are your goals for investing, right? Are your goals, and I think everybody's goal should be at some level cash flow. I know people that are very wealthy that are worth over $100 million, they're looking for cash flow. And then people that are, working their job, that are trying to leave it. My initial goal of wanting to get, we had, I think, 4 single family houses. I wanted to get to 30 so that I could leave my job through passive income. But I didn't realize that single family homes are a lot of work. Even if you have a property manager, which we did, it's still a lot of work because you got to go acquire them. You've got to, they ask you for decisions. Hey, the tenant damaged the toilet. Some is just the brain damage of getting these reports on how they're treating your property or not, or what's going negatively on it. And so I realized I was, in a way, kind of building another job. And so then I started to realize I had to look to another way. And it's just, buying 100-unit building is actually an easier process than buying several small single families. I mean, there's more to it in the sense, but you get better help. You have on-site management. You get better property management. You get it's transaction in one place. Typically, the maintenance is cheaper because you have a maintenance person, and you have typically the same types of appliances. You have the same types of paint colors, and it's just a much more efficient process. And so for me, I think everything sounds crazy until you've done it. And so whether if you've never invested, it just sounds like a crazy thing. And then when I invested in my first deal, it was like, oh, okay, I'm doing this multifamily. It sounds okay. And then as I started doing that, I started raising capital, and now it sounds crazy. I think I've raised tens of millions of dollars, but I think it's something that, really looking at what are your goals. My goals were cash flow, appreciation, and just seeing, okay, what am I actually getting for a return on this? If people that I know people that own homes in cash, and they're getting like a 2-3% return per year. It's like, that's not a good return, right? There are much other more efficient investments you can look at. So I think it's important to figure out what your goals are, whether it's reducing on taxes, it's cash flow or appreciation, or a combination of those, and really going after that.
Yeah, and especially kind of focusing on, the cash flow aspect. And the unfortunate thing kind of, and it's definitely maybe matriculated out of the general consciousness of the real estate investor in the past 2 years at least, but call it 2016 leading up, through the pandemic in 2020, everyone was looking like appreciation. Like, it was hard to lose money on a real estate deal. Even if you literally didn't know what you were doing, you could throw something at a wall and probably make 10 grand on it. The appreciation play was just so ingrained in what everyone thought, because you could have literally been doing this for the better part of a decade and really not had a problem, even if you functionally really shouldn't have been in real estate. But that cash flow aspect is really nice from a lot of perspectives. And again, not to again, get on my soapbox about cash flow and how much I like it, but it allows you to be so much more flexible with being able to invest a little bit more price point agnostic than otherwise if you're investing only for appreciation. And there certainly should be a healthy mixture of everything, right? You don't want to buy something, it rents great, but it's worth a third of what you paid for it. Because if you ever need to offload it, because life does happen, well, you don't want to take a huge bath and then, your growth is basically washed out, right? But again, that's why I like cash flow specifically. And again, the economy of scale you can build with the multifamily side of things is really nice. Just like you said, you could have 10 properties. Well, you have 10 different doorknobs, you have 10 different toilets, you have 10 different stoves. Whereas with that, you could rent a couple big storage lockers and have the same thing, everything there. Boom, it's fixed. There's no downtime. The tenants tend to be stickier. Again, it's nice. But so from that point on, again, let's kind of maybe springboard into really what we want to talk about today, which is the big I word of inflation. It's one of those things where it may go down a little bit, but look at history. I mean, it typically pretty much goes on kind of a upward trajectory to the right on that graph. You zoom out far enough and it's going to basically look like a straight line to the right. You will see dips, you will see increases, but for the most part, it does tend to trend in an upward fashion. So from the perspective of navigating higher inflationary periods, or at least kind of what we're going to right now, what are some strategies and how do you look at inflation from the investment as an investor?
Yeah. So again, I think it's a question that, it was more officially, inflation was up to, I think, 9% officially a couple years ago here. And so then they started raising interest rates. I still think inflation is substantially higher than what it's reported. I think the government has an incentive to tell you it's 3% when it's really much higher, 4, 5, 6%. And so, like you said, we know it's a certainty. I mean, if stuff today, you just get the grocery store, it costs over 50% more. Groceries cost 50% more or higher than they were in 2020, right? Because they created all this new currency. So something we kind of know over time, they're going to create more and more currency. There's going to be more and more, there's just going to be inflation. So there's ways that, instead of just seeing the pain at the grocery store or seeing the pain at the pump, you can actually use it to your advantage, right? You can actually use it in your favor. So, couple advantages, a couple things you can do with that. Obviously, real estate, if you can borrow today and pay off, with money that's lower than what inflation is. One example of this is I was able to, a few years ago, it's, these are hard to find today. You can't really find this today, but I got a 2.25% personal loan, non-secured for $100K. And it was a 10-year, it was to be paid back in 10 years, interest only the first 2 years. So I used that. I was able to basically invest in longer term investments that I know I'll get a higher return than 2.25%. And so it was almost like free money, right? So that for those type of things, those type of low interest rates, sometimes people ask me, like, if I have student loans, if I have a house payment, should I pay it off early? And I said, well, it depends on the rate. If your rate is 2.5% or 4% or something, you may want to just wait as long as you can. If it's credit card debt and it's 20%, you probably want to pay it off as soon as you can, right? Because it's almost like an investment that you're getting a guaranteed 20% return by paying it off, right? So I think some of the ways we use inflation to our advantage is we buy assets. And we buy assets that hedge inflation. So I love real estate for that reason. I love buying businesses. Like I mentioned, we're buying a business right now. I love precious metals. Precious metals have a 5,000-year monetary history. And so I buy things that they can't just print and create more of. And people don't realize this about fiat currency, which there's a difference between money and currency. Currency is just simply something that can be created more and more. It used to be that the US dollar, you'd have a $20 bill. It was exchangeable for a gold coin. You could actually go and slap it on a bank, and they would actually give you a 1 ounce gold coin, which now is worth about $3,000, right? So we know inflation is predictable. It's going to happen. There's some other methods too, but those are really the primary things. If you can buy assets that have some sort of inflation hedge, meaning they can't just be created very easily, buying things that, and also, you're basically buying assets that cash flow. So you're buying things that the best element is if they have a appreciation element based on inflation, and they have a cash flow element. And if you can use debt to do it, that's even better, especially low interest rate debt.
Yeah, and that's what I think, the concept of, looking at inflation, and to your point exactly, yeah, I'm never one to get too far into any type of political bias, but the government as a whole, it doesn't matter which administration is in power on either side of the aisle, but typically you're always going to see some type of underreporting either by the metric that they use, and that typically, people like to pick on the CPI, right? Well, it's a small microcosm of things that they look at and then try to extrapolate. The best thing that people can really do for inflation is just look at how do your dollars spend year over year. What did your grocery bill look like? What does your gas bill look like? How do things in your life actually affect that? And you're the best judge of your own personal finances. Don't let someone else try to, tell you everything. It's good to get outside advice. It's good to educate yourself, but understand that your personal relation to how far your dollar goes should be taken into account. Don't discount your own personal experience in anything when it comes to making decisions. Again, do your research, understand why things are happening is very important. But those things again are things not to be discounted. I think too far, especially when it comes to finance, people get so wrapped up in what other people tell them or what people they perceive as more intelligent than them are guiding them on. And there are certainly people much smarter than either myself or yourself that are invested in finance, right? Or that are kind of in finance and driving this machine. But again, personal experiences, what everyone should be focused on, a core part of all these decisions that we're making. So again, we're looking at things that, again, you find to be, good hedges against inflation, whether that be from the perspective of how cheap you can get the money. Because if you can get 2% money and inflation's running at, let's say, somewhere between 7 to 9%, I think it's probably somewhere in the real number of where it actually is. I think that's easy enough for people to understand. But when it comes to maybe some things that you mentioned, like businesses, that one's a little bit harder to peg down because a lot of people think, oh, well, if it's more expensive to go to the grocery store, maybe I buy less groceries. But as far as businesses that can be kind of a hedge against inflation, what are some ones that you like?
Yeah, businesses are unique because when you own a business, you have something that it has inherent value. It's producing cash, and this is what's amazing that I've discovered about the business side, having done real estate for a while, and then now we're transitioning to buying businesses. Is that there's a lot of businesses. For example, this business we're buying, it's an e-commerce business. It's niche cosmetics and women's apparel items, and it's selling for about 3 times profit. Right, so that means it's just crazy. If you were to convert that to a cap rate for what we're paying for the business, instead of a 5 to 7 cap rate, which means if you owned the building in cash or the property in cash, it'd be producing about 5 to 7% cash from what you paid for it. This is about a 30 to 35 cap rate, right? So it's way higher. And you say, well, why is that? Well, it takes a little more work to run a business. It depends on the type of business. But these are things, a lot of times businesses, there are businesses that are not great businesses, but there are a lot of businesses that are mom and pop businesses. They're even, if you know Cody Sanchez, she talks a lot about buying boring businesses, laundromats and plumbing businesses and all these things. And these are things that produce cash, right? So it's finding things that really produce the cash flow. And I think if you were to compare those two, I think you mentioned this before about appreciation versus cash flow. I always ask investors that which is more important. And most people are like, oh yeah, a little both, or I'm not sure, or maybe appreciation. But I think cash flow is just far superior because there's a few reasons. One is that with cash flow, you can basically use that money and reinvest. It also reduces your basis in the deal. And if something cash flows now, there's less risk that it's going to take 3 to 5 years or whatever to start cash flowing or cash flowing more to be able to get more cash flow now. So this is really why I like buying businesses. Now it's different. It's a different process. This business that we're closing, we basically went on our LOI or letter of intent with this business almost 6 months ago, right? Or about 6 months ago. So it's a longer process sometimes to be able to buy, to be able to get the financing, to be able to get the equity and kind of go through the diligence and everything. And but when you get it done, it's like, oh man, that was really a good move. That worked out really, really well. So I think that, again, it's coming back to those 3 things. People that are high earners and pay a lot in taxes. So if you're a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, a CPA, you could be paying 50 to 60% in taxes, right? So you need to find things that help reduce your taxable basis. There's things like oil and gas deals that allow you to reduce. I'm not a tax professional, but so seek your own help. But basically, help you reduce your actually taxable income, right? And there's other ones that help on the investment side. If you have investment losses that are paper losses, will help you there. Other ones are for cash flow, like we mentioned, like businesses, oil and gas. Those are two big ones, or even debt funds now sometimes provide some decent cash flow. And then there's appreciation, which there is a place for appreciation. But I think that sometimes we overweight appreciation, and where I think we should really focus a lot on cash flow. So businesses, again, there's a diligence process. We can talk more about what it takes to buy a business, but some people invest passively. Some people just do it themselves through networks they know. They start asking around their local laundromat or their mechanic or somewhere. They say, hey, do you own this business? What do you do? And I buy businesses in this area. And there's different ways to generate the ability to start buying businesses.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point there too, and especially in the context of what we're talking about with inflation. One, it's bad to have the same $10 buy less year over year than it did, right? I think we can all agree that's bad. If you can buy $10 worth of bread this year, and then that same $10 buys you $7.50 worth of bread the next year, no one's really happy about that. But to the point of what and I promise I'm making a point with this analogy, is that you have to have that $10 to spend, right? So if you're getting cash flow that's being paid out to you, that's awesome, but it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you keep, especially with those high wage earners. If you make $1 million and you're only taking home $450, that burns. I mean, you still have $450,000. That's really nice. That's a lot more than almost anyone else makes in the United States. But again, the principle can be extrapolated all the way down to, hey, if you make $20 on this and you only keep 10, well, that really burns, right? So from the perspective of when you invest in these things, again, none of us are probably trying to trade one squeeze for another one. So when it comes to making cash flow, the big thing is that how much are you going to be into the government for this? And again, from my perspective, and certainly from yours, we're not here to give tax or legal advice. I mean, legally I can't. I don't know what professional credentials you have, but I don't think anyone should really be taking tax advice from a podcast in general. Get a professional that understands and knows what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, because it is individual in nature. But again, as far as some guiding principles, and just kind of looking at how these things get exposed to taxes, again, I think it's, again, the thought that I think some people might have when it comes to buying a business is saying, hey, look, inflation's high, cash flow might be looking good for this, but if I'm making all this money like working for a business, how much different would it be if I buy this laundromat? Am I just getting another W-2 job? How are these things to be packaged to be effective from a tax perspective?
Yeah, so I think tax advantages are very important with buying businesses. It depends. I think if you can just get a lot of cash flow, I think that's great. And I don't think you should put the tax piece should be a part of it. A good deal should stand by itself, though, and I'd rather have a deal that produces incredible amounts of cash flow with no tax benefits, and then try to figure out some of the other tax. Is there ways I can reduce this, or do I have some carryover I can carry from other investments that I can cover that? But yeah, as far as businesses, it varies depending on the business. Some businesses have a lot. I mean, laundromats, some of these have, basically 100%. You can depreciate over time. The ATM business is a good one. Those depreciate. And when you have equipment or things like that, it can really work to help with depreciation. And there's other businesses like this e-commerce business we're buying. There's not a lot of tax benefits inherently built into the model, but there's people invest through those might be good ones to invest in through retirement accounts, right? Or invest in through other types of vehicles. And then, but again, maybe you have some investments that help you on the tax side and some that just provide a lot of cash flow. And so I just had a call earlier today with a high net worth couple, and they're in the medical field, and they're like, hey, we're selling this property, we're getting about $600,000 from the sale of this in equity, and what are some ideas you have to help to reduce that? And that's where tax strategists can help a lot. We do a little bit of tax strategist informally, not as a credentialed person, but I think trying to find things like oil and gas, trying to find other types of investments that allow, for depreciation. There's some speculation too that with Trump being back in office, that there'll be some new bills that will be added to kind of bring back those 2017, the Trump, basically real estate laws that were added in to be able to reduce increase the accelerated depreciation to 100%, right? So that was for a number of years you could invest, and basically up to 100% of your initial investment was a deduction year one. So as long as you keep having that, you could kind of keep pushing that forward. So there's some speculation around that. We'll see if that happens, but I think that would really help real estate investors obviously quite a bit. But I think it's all part of the comprehensive plan, right? It's all trying to figure out what you want. And I think that's the thing. If you get clear on what you want, a lot of people I know, I wrote this book, Fire Yourself, behind me here, and it's just about how do you replace your working income with passive income. Taxes are a big part of that, right? So how do we do that? And I think the biggest thing is figuring out what your goals are. How much do you actually need? What is your rat race number? How much do you need to live, right? Maybe you only need 5 or 10,000 a month to live, which, was like, okay, well, I can do that. I can figure that out. For me, it was about 7 or 8,000. I was like, if I can get that, I'll be okay. And even though I live in LA, it was enough. And so finding ways to grow that number, and then you can figure out, okay, how do I reduce taxes, or how do I work on these other things? So I think it's good to kind of have, when you look at investments, just figure out what your goals are and just keep coming back to that. And then as you evaluate deals, say, well, will this help me get me closer to my goal from a cash flow perspective, which I think is huge. Because if you could add, a few $1,000s a month in cash flow per year, that's huge, right? Because then over time, and eventually your passive income will replace your working income, right? If you can just keep growing that number.
Yeah, and in general too, like the more passive income that you can kind of get into your pipeline of your revenues that you make, it's more or less, again, painting with a very broad brush, going to be a little bit more favorable of a tax perspective, right? Passive income as a whole is generally more tax favored than your active earned income. Now that can vary widely depending on how you've invested in something, what your other investments look like, how many kind of write-offs you have. I mean, to your point about the e-commerce business, it may not offer much in the way because there's not much there's not much like tangible like equipment there, right? Like there's some computers, there's if everything's done kind of drop shipped, like, and again, there's maybe not like warehousing and real estate that can be used as write-offs, but again, if the cash flows are amazing, again, that's awesome. But for the most part, again, passive income with what most people are looking at, and I think what reaches a little bit more of the broader audience, like a brick and mortar business, maybe it owns the building, maybe it has like the laundromat, they got big pieces of capital equipment, those washers ain't cheap. You talk about real estate, the tax benefits for real estate are immense, and I'll get into those in a minute. But again, I kind of like what you're saying there of, maybe work backwards from that goal, right? We don't always necessarily need to say, hey, we have this huge thing. Like, figure out the small, attainable part of it, right? Does everything going to be covered and give you enough to live comfortably with, making $10,000, $120,000 a year of passive income? Again, typically it's probably going to be taxed a lot better than 120 grand of W-2 income. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, again, maybe if you live in LA, that's maybe not quite enough. I mean, you sound like you made it work, but, if you live somewhere, that can work for you, again, you start looking at how much you need to actually do, especially in things like real estate, to make that work. It's not as much as some people might think, to get to some of those kind of numbers with, the way that, especially how expensive rent has gotten in proportion to almost every single market now. And rents typically don't have much of precipitous drops, right? They go to a certain point and they not much clawback on that. We're not going to see rents going back down to pre-COVID levels. They'll adjust some, and depending on where you're at, they might adjust quite a bit. But for the most part, that average 3-2 block house that everyone loves so much, you're probably not going to get that and anywhere that most people live for less than maybe $1,800, $2,000 a month. It's just kind of a hard fact. And in most places, it's probably going to be a lot more than that. So when you think about some of those, cash flows that you can start making, definitely beneficial. So let's move maybe a little bit into kind of two other things that you talked about. And especially how it kind of plays into, inflation. Oil and gas is one that we do, quite a bit of here on the professional side at Advanta IRA with clients investing in mineral rights, whether that be through bond investments, whether that be through oil and gas leasing on tangibly owned real estate. But that would be something, at least from the inflation perspective, pain at the pump, right? As, kitsch as that term may sound, it's true. Gas does tend to fluctuate a lot more than other things. So when you have maybe a price point fluctuation with the actual underlying like commodity being sold, but also just, how it plays into the general mindset of the populace. So when it comes to what makes attractive oil and gas investments for you, maybe expound about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think, in general, I mean, we could go into just oil and gas in general. I think there's been this big green movement, and I think it's great. We use less fossil fuels. I think using solar and using other things is great. I drove an electric car for a while. It was great. And I think it's all necessary. The challenge with, especially where I live in California, where they say, hey, we're not going to let you sell cars in 2030 that are electric cars. They have to be their gas cars. They have to be electric cars. It's just not possible. It's not possible to go as quickly as we would want to go completely green because we don't have the rare earth minerals we need. We don't have all these different things we need to be able to get there. We don't have the power. Even in California, it's like, let's go green, drive an electric car. It's like, well, 50% of electricity is imported into California from other states, and most of that's through burning coal, right? So they're burning coal or natural gas and then transporting, which is very inefficient. And that's how we get a lot of our electricity here, right? So then you're driving a clean vehicle after burning these dirty fossil fuels. So it's kind of funny how that works. There's a really interesting book that kind of illustrated this for me. It's called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. It was a really good book that just kind of talks about this. But because of this green agenda, there's a lot of financial groups and funds, they cannot invest in dirty energy, which would be like, oil and gas or other sorts of things that are non-renewable. But the challenge is, like, there's been no production, like presentations or any sort of forecast that say we're going to need less energy, less fossil fuels than we need right now. So I think that, it really, fossil fuels do make our lives better. They give us reliable power. They give us cars to be able to drive around, like boats and planes. A lot of these things, they can't run on electricity, at least at this point. So I hope we can make that transition. But the challenge is over the last 15 years, there's been a huge underinvestment in new oil drilling, new gas drilling. And so, that's something that the more we can get involved with that, and it's actually, there's a lot of other groups that can't do it, right? They've signed something that says we can't do any of this, non-renewable energy. And so there's two factors. That one is that it's going to be, oil and gas are going to cost continually more over time. And secondly, it gives opportunities for investors that are willing to do it. But the challenge is I think we need all the energies, right? I think we need solar, we need wind, we need all this stuff. But over the last 100 years, we've had both solar and wind, and they currently produce 3% of the world's energy, right? So after 100 years, they produce 3%. So it's not really conceivable we're going to get that other 97%. All of a sudden, just something's going to happen. Now, I think nuclear, there's other ways we can potentially generate more energy. But I think that just this idea of the world needing more energy, it's going to continue to come from fossil fuels, and technology gets better to go after and find, whether through fracking or deep sea stuff and other things like that. And of course, there are challenges with everything, but it really makes our lives way better. And so on the investment side, to be able to get involved with this, there's just a lot of upside. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to see oil drilling deals that are producing, kind of between, 20 and 30% returns per year, right? That's not uncommon. And the technology's got much better in oil drilling, where it used to be, you get a lot of dry holes. You go down horizontal, oh, we missed, sorry, well, let's go over here. Well, now the technology's gotten better to where they can actually really tell that there's oil down there with a very high degree of certainty. And then they go down. If they miss, then they can just turn the drill sideways and drill horizontally until they hit it, right? So there's all these different creative things they've done. And then when you invest in oil and gas drilling, you get, like I mentioned earlier, 80 to 85% of ordinary income, W-2 income, 1099 income, active income can actually be reduced. It's something that's been in the tax code for a long time, and it's really it's amazing. So you imagine getting a great return, and also getting a tax benefit that you actually reduce ordinary income. So for example, again, no specific advice, but let's say I make $200K a year and I invest $100K into something like this, I could reduce my taxable income by around $85,000, right? So it looks as if I've only made $115,000, right? Which is amazing. So again, you're getting not only the benefit of the upside and the cash flow, and there are risks, of course, like with every investment, but having that. And so for high earners, it can be really, really valuable, because in my book, I talk about this. I went from a 25% taxable rate to about a 1% taxable rate, right? Using strategies like this. Also, there's something called the real estate professional designation. And so finding the ways that, people call them loopholes, but really what they are is they're incentives, right? The government they've given you a playbook through the tax code on how to partner with them to do what they have an agenda for. So they need affordable housing, they need energy, they need farming. So if you can do these things that they've incentivized you to do, that's how you pay less in taxes, because you're basically partnering with them.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, again, I always like to, take kind of some really good points that our guests make and kind of, bring it down to a little bit more visual level, especially with, energy production. It is not hard to see kind of where things need to happen. It is, think about it. Is it possible for them to put in enough solar to generate power for, let's say, Southern California? No, it's definitely not to do that immediately quickly. Also, people say, oh, what about nuclear? Well, I don't think people realize so many of the nuclear infrastructure in the United States was basically stopped after 1978. Once 3 Mile Island happened, we had a moratorium. The first new production facility coming online is in Tennessee. And with the technology of them not being built for so long, it had like a $2 billion overrun. Again, I'm a huge nuclear proponent, huge into it, but like places like Southern California, San Onofre is being decommissioned. It was providing like
Yeah.
25% of the usable power for Southern California, and it is almost
Yeah.
fully decommissioned now. I don't think it's
Wow.
been producing since like 2017. But it's like, if even if you don't know what this place is, you've seen a picture of it. It's like the big picturesque beast, and then you have like the cooling, like the containment domes right there on the beach and
Yeah.
a little bit north of San Diego, which is sad to see. For the aspect of, hey, like we have a potentially very clean energy source. Well, if you get rid of that and you can't tool up these renewables that fast, what are you left with? Well, oil, natural gas are kind of your production facilities that can be tooled up quickly. So while is this stuff going to be around forever? No, but there's an immediate need for it, and probably within my lifetime being 36, and I would say honestly probably up until like people in their mid 20s, like probably your entire lifetime you're not going to see this stuff completely go away and it still be kind of a viable trajectory for investment. So let's say the next 70 years, we're kind of stuck with this stuff. And it's not all energy as well. This stuff is used, in everything.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
oil and gas has a lot of different interesting avenues with it. And again, if it's not something you're comfortable investing with it for personal reasons of not wanting to do that, those are decisions you need to make. But the big point to make is like, look, if you're looking to make investments, and you can invest in oil and gas companies that have more that align with kind of your general thoughts on the underlying investment. Are they making bullets? No, but again, is it harmful to the planet? Well, certainly to a point. But it's a need, right? We got to have it. There's no way getting around it. Trucks
Yeah.
got to move, ships got to go across the ocean. You need to keep the lights on at your house. You got to
Yeah.
have oil and gas. So there's a very sticky aspect, no pun intended, to
Yeah.
oil and gas in just the general investment realm. And to your point too, you want to talk about interesting tax benefits that you don't really see anywhere else. Look up tax benefits for farming and oil and gas exploration and production. You think that there's some interesting, again, not loopholes. The government gives these incentives to
Incentives.
drive investment, but there's some wild ones, right? Where you don't see
Yeah.
anywhere else besides those two industries. Farming's a little bit harder of one to crack into as far as the investment side of things, at least in my opinion. I haven't seen too many people in my 13-year career really do it effectively at scale. There's been a few, again, niche stuff, and certainly you could make the argument for legal cannabis, but the issues with the federal government and the banking system for doing that is tough. There's people made a lot of money on it, but it still kind of hasn't gotten to the point where the average rank and file investor could probably see a big benefit to that. But yeah, it's definitely something out there that bears looking at for people. And again, from that inflationary perspective, I'd imagine I want you to get your thought on that with oil and gas. Do you think that just kind of the utilization and the need for it and the immediacy kind of again outstripes what potential like inflationary issues there might be with investing in that?
Well, I think, personally, I think that oil and gas, it has an inflation hedge built in as well, because the more currency is created, it actually is a bit hedged. Now there's some volatility; it can go up and go down. Some of these, drillers, you can say, what's the break even cost, right? So hopefully you're looking for, if oil now is, I haven't checked it lately, but probably $60-$70, per barrel. If that's the case, then, if it goes down to 40, maybe, are they still breaking even and making money? But I think that over time, again, fiat currency, we're going to only continue to see things cost more and more from a fiat standpoint of just creating more and more currency. So in that case, that's very inflationary, that things like oil and gas and other things, for multiple reasons. One is you have more currencies, that's a monetary inflation, but then you also have an underinvestment, right? I mean, you can just look at the charts. If you look at just the total cost, the amount spent by groups like Shell and Chevron and all these large, even small companies to go explore and find new oil reserves, it basically peaked in around 2008, And it's been like half or a third of what it was almost every single year since then. And again, this is because big finance has really wanted to do that. They wanted to, we want to have less investment in this, but effectively, kind of as you mentioned, that just is going to lead to higher costs, right? So as an investor, where do you want to be positioned? Assuming you don't have a moral issue with investing in fossil fuels, you want to be in fossil fuels, right? So I think that there's a lot of upside. We're doing it two different ways. We have actually several different ways. We've got one that's a startup kind of tech play, more of a VC play in that we've done. We also have done within the oil and gas space, we've done kind of the traditional drilling, like I mentioned, and then we're doing other deals that are related to just owning the land, right? The non-operating working interest of just owning the land. For example, there's 140 producing wells on this piece of land that we own, and then when these large drillers like Marathon Oil or these big producers, they go in and they've done all the research that we want to put a new drill here on your land. You say, okay, great. And then we are able to financially participate in that and get a substantial amount of the upside, right? So that's a much less risky way that cash flows almost from day one. So there's different ways to invest in oil and gas, right? So there's different ways to do it. So I think that in general, I think it has a place in people's portfolio. I know people that love it do a high percentage of their portfolio with it. There was a time during COVID where the price of oil in the U.S. went to minus $40 a barrel because they couldn't store it anywhere. So that was there are risks involved with everything, but of course that was pretty much a black swan type of event. So I think that what I like about it is I like the cash flow element of it. I like the tax benefits of it. I like that again there's a theme. So I think for all of us, no matter how sophisticated you are as an investor, how new you are as an investor, it's good to kind of start to have these ideas of what's happening in the world. Well, we have this huge green trend that obviously under Trump has kind of become less pronounced. They've started to kind of open things up again. But around the world, especially in Europe and other places, there really is this big green trend. Well, in that case, there's been an underinvestment in the things we actually really need and use. It's almost like an out of favor investment, which is also a benefit, right? You're investing in something that's not always popular to invest in. And as you invest, there's an inflation hedge there, and there's, like I mentioned, the cash flow. So I want to say the perfect investment, but it's a great place to be because of all of those elements, right? You have an inflation hedge, you've got cash flow, you've got tax benefits, you will have appreciation because of the inflation and just because of the underinvestment. And so again, that's an investment theme that I see in that asset, and that's one of the reasons I love that asset class.
Yeah, and also from the aspect of, talking about Europe, just to pick on that for a second, you want to talk about people that want fast energy independence, especially with what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and the thought that that might spread. You can't tool up wind farms and solar to the scale. Again, you can put them in quickly, but to the scale that's needed for whole countries like a Germany or a Poland to have more independence from a reliance on a certain region's natural resources. Again, oil and gas is kind of how the immediacy of that need is going to be met. So, again, notwithstanding any moral issue that you may have regarding the entire industry, you can kind of see how there's, direct benefits to that. And at least my take on the, investing in the greener side of that is the disjointedness of the different competing industries, right? You can invest in oil and gas and they can do a bunch of different stuff with it. It can be used to make medical devices, parts of your computers, all sorts of different stuff. And, a small, a portion of that is used for energy production, but there's so many utilizations of that. How do you pick out the right people making like silicone wafers for solar panels? Like how many different people out there are making wind turbine generators and that stuff? It's just the commonality of these different industries is tough to pin down from what I've seen. And are the people out there making money at? Absolutely. But I just haven't at least talked to anyone. And again, full disclosure, I haven't had any exposure on my investing personal side into the greener side of things. But I also haven't talked to anyone that really has been able to kind of coherently give a path forward on how to really effectively invest in that market as a whole, just from the kind of disjointed nature of the different competing technologies.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of government subsidies there as well, and that stuff changes. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which ironically is probably going to lead to higher inflation, but a lot of credits around that. And there are ways to do all of it. So I think it's just finding, when you find an opportunity, it's looking into it, looking at the pros and cons, really evaluating it, seeing what do you see the primary risk or risks being. And I think I give a kind of a framework on how you vet and look at different deals in different assets, right? Some people think, well, real estate's so different than oil and gas, or it's so different than buying businesses. And I'm like, no, it's pretty much the same. It's just you've got to look at what's the business plan, what are the risks, who are the operators, and what's the process you're going to go through to see how that will work, or if it doesn't work, what do you think it's going to be that doesn't work? And ask the operator, the partners, hey, what are the biggest risks in this deal that you see, right? And so those are all things that I think are very important.
Yeah, and I'd like it, and the nice thing to kind of bring this in for the last part of our conversation is the commonality of where we started, right, with real estate. Notwithstanding the e-commerce play, because that's, again, its own little unique thing, which is super interesting. Not something I've personally had much of experience besides just all the crap that I buy on Amazon, but it's the industry as a whole is very interesting from the investment standpoint. But the cool commonality that we have between buying businesses, again, notwithstanding e-commerce, oil and gas, and then coming to real estate, is all of them typically do have a real estate component to it, right? Where do you get oil? Well, you drill it out of the ground. Again, offshore is a little bit different story, but so much of what we generate in the United States is between stuff like in the Permian Basin, and still some production in California and up in the Northeast United States, is kind of pulling it out of the ground. Like you see the wellheads, pumping up and down, or to an extent fracking. That's done on real estate. Businesses that operate like a laundromat, you walk into a store that's in a piece of real estate. Buying rental properties, those are real estate assets. And the cool kind of commonality to look at real estate, not only from the cash flow perspective of putting a person into it, but how many different ways you can break that up. If you like real estate, but you also like oil and gas, or hey, you like the business side of things, you can marry those up in very interesting and effective ways to kind of, again, have something that, while yes, businesses can go out of operation, right? They can, the place that was selling, asbestos insulation in the 50s, I guarantee you they're not there anymore, but that building probably still is. Hopefully it's been remediated, but there's things that you're just not going to see anymore, right? You're not going to see a vet on every corner because nothing's drug around by horses anymore. You're going to have these things that are going to have a sticky component, and real estate is probably one of the stickiest assets out there. Just like you live in California, we were talking about before the podcast. We live in areas that are prone to natural disasters. Things can get ripped down to the actual soil, but there is still an asset there. There's still something that can be rebuilt. Enrons go away, WorldComs go away, but things like real estate will stick around. Maybe that oil well dries up, so got a piece of real estate. Do some cattle ranching on it. Put in a solar farm. Again, there's things with real estate that really kind of drive the interest in it. And there's a lot of different ways that people look at it, especially from today, social media. It gets a lot of press, and rightfully or unrightfully so. There's a million different people out there telling you a million different things, but the underlying value of it as it relates to, one, cash flow, two, appreciation, and three, a hedge against inflation, shouldn't be unmeasured, right? They're not making any more of it, right?
Yeah.
With the exception of what they're doing in Dubai, and I think those ironically are kind of getting swallowed by the ocean. With I think it's the one that they try to make look like the globe. They can underpin it well enough, and the ocean's kind of taking back.
Oh man. Okay.
So
didn't know that.
But again, not to make light of any of that. It's just those are the reasons why I kind of, one, do what I do professionally, two, love having guests like you on to talk about that. So again, to get off my soapbox and back down to kind of the conversation at hand, is where do you really see kind of the investor, again, that they're saying, look, I need to really kind of make a change. And again, all these things have a flair of real estate. But if someone's kind of looking at this from the perspective of, hey, okay, I like this, right? Where do you kind of feel the best place for people to get some initial exposure to real estate is? Having your experience and doing what you have done over the past, 7 to 10 years, where do you feel is a good starting point? And again, we're not talking monetary, saying, hey, make sure you have X, Y, and Z, just like the thing that would probably offer the most value to people to get them educated and experienced in these kind of alternative ways of looking at finance when it comes to real estate.
Yeah, so I think educating yourself through podcasts like this, through books. I have my book behind me that I wrote. If you haven't read Rich Dad Poor Dad or Cash Flow Quadrant or Think and Grow Rich, these are all either finance books or mindset books. And it's just finding things, the people that are different than what you're doing. I mean, if you keep doing what you're doing now, you will get the results you've always gotten. It's very predictable. If you just keep, doing your job, investing in stocks, have your money person, it's a very predictable result, right? I do have a gift for your audience. I know we're kind of wrapping up on our time here, but I have a gift for your audience that's kind of on this topic of how to use inflation to your advantage. And so it's a 40-page book. It talks about some of the strategies we mentioned, as well as borrowing, even using precious metals and other things to be able to do that, to buy assets. So if your audience texts the word inflation to 33777, I can send you guys a free copy to that. So it's just the word inflation to the number 33777. So if you go and text that. But I think really the best thing that we invest in is in our own education. We invest in ourselves first. Warren Buffett says that. A lot of smart people do. You can't just delegate your money and say somebody else do this. You really need to understand yourself how finances work. It is very, very important to understand, really, and how you understand it just by learning, by asking questions. I think local meetups are a great way. Conferences are a great way. Making friends. We have a mastermind we started recently called the Wealth Forum, which puts high net worth people together just to talk through, hey, who have you worked with and what's working for you and what's tax strategy, and getting people involved. So I think it's pursuing all the things that we mentioned. And I think step one is just, making a decision that you're going to do it, and then actually taking daily, weekly action.
Yeah, and to that point, again, I couldn't agree more. Two things I would add are, the it's corny as it sounds, but don't have analysis paralysis, right? It's great to educate yourself, get out there, but you got to take action. You got to take that first step and do something with the education that you're taking in. And also the second thing I encourage everyone to look at and understand is, what is the reason behind why anyone's educating you, right? Everyone has an agenda, and that's not a bad thing. Again, we all have a reason why we do stuff. There's a reason I do this podcast. There's a reason Bronson came on, that he has a business. They're trying to do things. So are we. But always understand where your education is coming from and what kind of color that might add to why people are saying what they're saying. And that might certainly align perfectly with your beliefs, which is great, but just understand that, there's a reason why people put this stuff out there. And so much the social media kind of culture that we all live in, the propensity for people to come out and give bad or misinformed advice, or just things that are maybe a little bit too self-serving to the person giving the advice, is a problem that you need to navigate. So again, those are just the kind of two things that I would add on to the back end of that, is that you definitely educate yourself, get information, make sure it's good information, and take some action. Go out there and especially with real estate, if you buy something, even if it's a horrible experience, you still got something to sell. At the end of the day, you still have that asset that's there that can hopefully not be too underwater. But again, I would imagine anyone listening to this podcast is probably educated enough or is on that track to make those good decisions. So Bronson, again, really appreciate you being on with us today. If people want to reach out to you between the professional stuff and the education stuff that you have going on, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I got that free guide. So if you text the word inflation to 33777, that'll give you that guide and also put you in touch with what we're doing. So yeah, but appreciate it. I also have my book on Amazon if you want to check that out.
Oh, great. Do you have a website?
I do. Yeah, BronsonEquity.com. So yeah, it's good. I mean, honestly, if people download the guide, then they'll get access to everything.
All right, fantastic. Well, again, the most valuable asset we all have is our time, because no matter how well we invest or what we do, we can't make any more of it. So thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of your day to talk with us and our audience at large. This has been the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. As always, my name is Alex Perny. Thanks for joining with us, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in to the Alternative Investing Advantage podcast. Tune in next week for more investing tips and strategies.
Want to hear more episodes of the Alternative Investing Advantage? Search podcast at advantaira.com and subscribe.